So thanks for coming in the morning. So this week we have two seminars. So we're pleased to have Pascal Schweitzer. Darmstadt? Yes. So we talk about isomorphisms. Probably. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for coming, and thanks a lot for having me. So I'll be talking about symmetry, algorithms, and graph isomorphism. And the talk is kind of separated into two parts. The first is kind of a general introduction, which should be nice and easy, and everything should be clear. And maybe the last part, which is maybe the last fifth or something like that, I will talk about some newer results, which are maybe more relevant to some specialists, and it will be quite condensed and maybe a bit speedy. But if you have questions about that, I'm happy to discuss them afterwards. So we're here until Friday. I can happily chat and fill in the details that I'm going to leave out in the end. All right, so I will talk about symmetries, basically. So here's an image with a symmetry. Okay, this image is actually from the Confucian school in Gyeongju. Yeah? And you can see many symmetries here, actually. So you can see the image I just had, or you can see a mirror symmetry in the middle. You can see symmetries on the roof tiles, for example. So I think we all know what symmetry is. For example, it's obvious that this tree on the left is symmetric and the tree on the right is not symmetric. But I rather would want to talk about combinatorial kinds of symmetries. For example, the formula on the bottom left here, x squared y plus y squared x minus y, it's symmetric in x and y. Yeah? What do I mean by that? I mean, if I interchange the values that go into x and y, the outcome will be the same. Or up here I have a logical formula, a and b, or b and c, or c and a, and it's symmetric in a, b, and c at the same time, whatever that means. And here I have a graph, which is obviously symmetric, but it also has combinatorial symmetries, and I will get back to that in a second. If you guys have any questions along the ride, feel free to interrupt me whenever you want. I think everything I say should be pretty clear, and it should be clear when I leave out details, and then you can still ask. Right. So, with regard to symmetry, it turns out that it's actually sufficient to just look at graphs. If you're interested in combinatorial symmetries, graphs are just sufficient. So there's a theorem that says that the computation of arbitrary symmetries of any combinatorial object actually reduces to computation of symmetry of graphs. So it's always okay to just do graphs, is what the statement is. And we could work through this. I could give you a proof and something like that, but I think two examples will just convince you. Here are two examples. Here's this formula from the previous slide. And what I've drawn now is the evaluation DAG, the graph tree. It's not quite a tree. And what you can see is that so for example here, I have a multiplication and y feeds twice into that, so this node corresponds to y squared, and this node here then corresponds to x y squared, and so forth. And what you can see here is the reflection symmetry in the middle. So you can actually see in the graph that x and y are symmetric in the formula. Or this logical formula that I had before, a and b, or b and c, or c and a, it's symmetric in a, b, and c. And the only reason we can't see it here is because I haven't drawn it the right way. So if I actually draw it in a more symmetric fashion, then suddenly you see, oh, it's obviously symmetric in A, B, and C. And the theorem basically says you can do that with any kind of object you like.
I have a small question here. When you say of graphs, do you mean directed graphs, undirected graphs?
Okay, that's a good question. What do we mean? Directed graphs, undirected, node labeled, and so forth. Turns out this is all the same. Okay. Yeah, so I've actually used colors here. I've distinguished some vertices, and I've used some directed edges. You could get rid of the directed edge by subdividing and then using some colors to indicate a direction. Yeah, okay. And you can also get rid of the colors. So the way you can get rid of the colors, I usually give this as an exercise in one of my classes, and there's many, many ways of doing it. Here's one way of doing it. You start with a graph, and you want to remove the colors. You can hash them to numbers. Equal colors go to equal numbers. And then you can just attach some gadgets that preserve the structure. So for example, for the blue ones, there's a 1, and then I've always attached this tree, and I've attached different kinds of trees for different things. And it's kind of a nuisance looking at this in detail. It's probably easier for you to think about that you could do this yourself. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's many ways of doing this. This one here preserves the degree. That's why I usually use that.
Does this universality also apply to geometric objects? Like in the first picture you have trees, right?
It applies to combinatorial objects if the geometry of the object is given by combinatorics, then it applies. But if it's in a geometric space where you don't have the object concretely given, for example, in a vector space, and you're talking about linear maps, and the linear maps are not reflected in the object, then this is not true anymore. In particular, it doesn't apply if the object is not explicitly given, for example, by generating sets. This is usually the thing. If you give an object in a vector space by a basis or something like that, then this doesn't apply anymore. It does apply if you write it down in a verbose fashion, but then you have exponential blow up. Yeah, so there's a catch here if it's a compact encoding or a non-compact encoding. Yeah. For example, for groups, you also have to be careful. Other questions? All right. So I want to talk about symmetries, but usually I will actually call it automorphisms. So I think most of you know what an automorphism is. An automorphism is an isomorphism from a graph to itself. Here the Peterson graph has this rotational automorphism. You can map it to itself. Yeah. So and I can follow where the points go. Okay, but this graph also has a different kind of symmetry, has this reflection symmetry, for example. Yeah. So it's maybe slightly difficult to see, but if I show the arrows, you can follow it. Yeah. Okay. But lastly, this object has a combinatorial kind of symmetry that is not a geometric kind of symmetry. So there is a possibility to interchange the inside with the outside. The outside pentagon with the inside pentagon. It looks like that. Yeah. So I'm not talking about geometric symmetries only. I'm talking about all the combinatorial intrinsic symmetries of the object. Okay. Anyway, so the automorphisms of this object form a group. You can compose them. It's a group by composition. There's a trivial element, and there's inversions and so forth, inverse elements and so forth. So that's called the automorphism group of the graph. And the second thing I will be talking about, I'm talking about these symmetries. And now I'm making a small step to the graph isomorphism problem, and I'll come back in a second. So the graph isomorphism problem, I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Here are two graphs. Two graphs are isomorphic if there's a bijection from the one graph, from the vertices of the one graph to the vertices of the other graph that preserves adjacency and non-adjacency. For example, these two graphs here are isomorphic because the one graph is just a redrawn version of the other graph. Yeah? And this graph isomorphism problem now is an algorithmic problem. Given two graphs, the question is, are they isomorphic or not? So you put them into a computer and you have some algorithm and it should say yes or no. It's a decision problem. And it turns out to be one of the larger, important open problems in theoretical computer science. It's still open, it's very well known, and it is a core topic of a research project we've been doing in my research group, and I will kind of present many of the research findings we've done over the years on this problem in the context of this problem. All right. Now, I talked about automorphisms and symmetries, and I talk about the graph isomorphism problem. What's the connection? The core insight is that these two problems are the same problem. So symmetry, computation of symmetry, and the graph isomorphism problem is the same problem, and that is why the problem is so important. And I can argue why. Let's say we have a graph, and we want to compute the symmetries of the graph. But we only have an oracle that solves the graph isomorphism problem. What we can do is we can create a copy of the graph, and now we can take some vertices and color them in a particular fashion. We know how to do colors. We already talked about this. So we can do colors. And now I can ask my graph isomorphism oracle, is there an isomorphism from here to here, mapping the green vertex to the green vertex? Now, this will imply it's an automorphism of the graph, because the graph is the same. And it will be a non-trivial automorphism because I forced the green vertex to go somewhere else. And now if I move on with the green vertex and I probe different vertices, and I do that in a very systematic fashion, it turns out that I can actually compute all the symmetries of the graph. I have to be a bit careful because there's an exponential number, but if you do it right, you can get a compact representation, a generating set for the group. So if I know how to do this, I know how to do this. Now, the other direction is also not that difficult. So if I know how to do symmetry detection, I claim I can do graph isomorphism tests. And it works as follows. Suppose you have two graphs, and you want to know whether they're isomorphic or not. Now, without loss of generality, I'm going to assume that these graphs are connected. Otherwise, I add a vertex adjacent to everything else or something like that. Now, let's consider the disjoint union of these two graphs. The disjoint union of these two graphs, how many symmetries does it have? Well, if the disjoint union, you can permute the vertices in here. You can permute the vertices in here. Now, if the graphs are not isomorphic, you can arbitrarily combine these two permutations, but that's all you can do. But if the graphs are isomorphic, you can also swap the two. In particular, if the graphs are isomorphic, there will be more symmetries of the disjoint union. Or more formally, the order of the automorphism group of the disjoint union will be the product of the two orders if they're not isomorphic, and it will be twice the product if they're isomorphic, in particularly larger. If I have an oracle for this, I can check all of these numbers, and I can just check whether which of the two cases holds. Yeah? That means symmetry detection is equivalent to graph isomorphism, and that is the reason why graph isomorphism is so interesting. Yeah? Because it's actually the symmetry problem. It's the symmetry computation problem. Now, what's the complexity status of this problem? Okay, as you all know, NP is the class of efficiently verifiable problems, and P is the class of efficiently decidable problems. Now, we don't know whether these are the same or not, whether there's a gap. We do know, though, that graph isomorphism sits in NP, because if I give you the green arrows, if I show you the isomorphism, you can check that it's an isomorphism. But you don't maybe know how to find it. Okay, so it turns out that graph isomorphism doesn't really know which way to go yet. The status used to be basically an n to the root n sub-exponential time algorithm. This is from the 80s. This is Babai put together various things from Jean Lux and Semyachenko. But then in 2015, there was a breakthrough to quasi-polynomial time, n to the log of n to the c. So the theorem is that the graph isomorphism problem can be solved in quasi-polynomial time, 2 to the log n to the c. My understanding is this c is 3. And this kind of running time is basically stable under polynomial time reduction. And that means if graph isomorphism was NP complete, SAT, for example, could be solved in this running time, which would be breaking the exponential time hypothesis. So that should give you a strong indication, no, not a strong indication, that could make you believe that graph isomorphism is not NP complete. It just has implications. All right, actually, Babai, he solves a more general problem. He doesn't just solve the graph isomorphism problem, he solves the so-called string isomorphism problem. I'm not going to define it, but I will give you an example in a second. We have some improvement on of this, or some evolved algorithm which works for bounded degree graphs if you are interested in it, but this is some time ago. I'm not going to talk about it. Anyway, so the string isomorphism problem, it's actually, this is an instance of the string isomorphism problem, the Rubik's Cube, putting the Rubik's Cube back into original position. So what you see here is called the superflip, yeah, and it was actually shown with massive computational effort that 20 moves always suffice, and this superflip is one of these situations where 20 moves must be. So this is one of the worst case instances, or if you want, it's the diameter of the Cayley graph. Yeah, so you need 20 moves for the superflip. There are other things. So this was solved in 2010 with this massive computation. Kutsiemba actually comes from Darmstadt. He's a physics and math teacher just south of Darmstadt. So he recently gave a talk in our seminar about this. Anyway, so this is the string isomorphism problem is basically for general kinds of problems to solve this. And this is what Babai's algorithm solves in quasi-polynomial time. That's what I wanted to say about symmetries. Do you guys have any questions about symmetries? All right.
How many hours did you put for making these slides?
Up to here or for the whole? So some of these slides I did during COVID, yeah, and I thought I have to give something to my students. They're sitting at home in front of their computer and so forth. And of course, many of the images I will reuse. Yeah, okay, but sometimes they also help to make it just even more clear. Yeah, all right. Too many is the answer. All right, and it's not even the right way. So these are all ticks animations. Yeah, it's ticks. But it's not the way to do it. There are better ways of doing it. Anyway.
Maybe a follow-up question. Are you running a YouTube channel or something?
Don't have one now. But all right. So the second thing I want to talk about is canonization. And what we see here, these are actually different kinds of pigments from the Gyeongju National Museum. And the way you should think of this is that this is a database where you have different pigments, and then you can look up in the database, so you can put it into a kind of common form, and then you can look up in the database what it is. So whether it's a coral or some hematite or something like that. Yeah. So this is how canonization works to classify molecules or graphs, and this is what we use in discrete math as well. So a canonical form is kind of a normal form for graphs, and the equivalence is isomorphism. Yeah, so it's a normal form up to isomorphism. So let G be the class of all graphs. Then I'm going to define a canonical form as follows. It's a map from the class of all graphs to the class of all graphs. So each graph gets a new graph such that, first of all, the vertices of the canonical form are 1 through n. So the vertices are going to be renamed into the numbers 1 through n. Yeah, so all the canonical forms, they have standardized vertex names, namely 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. The second requirement is that the canonical form is isomorphic to the thing you started with. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, if you want a canonical version, then it should better be the same as what you started with. And the last requirement is that you have two isomorphic graphs. The canonical form should be equal rather than isomorphic. And that means you can just look up whether they're the same or not. Let me make that more precise in a second. Now, canonical labeling assigns to every graph an isomorphism from G to the canon, and it's basically an enumeration of the vertices. This is the first vertex, second, third, and so forth. All right, so we can use this to do isomorphism checks, but we can also use it in practice. So how do you typically use canonical forms in practice? Well, oftentimes in practice, you actually need canonical forms rather than isomorphism. Okay, let's say you have a library of millions of chemical molecules, yeah, or the pigments if you want, and you want to identify an unknown molecule. What you do is you use canonical forms, and that way you can avoid having to compare pairs of things. Yeah, you can just look it up in the database. Instead of looking it up, let's say you've got this molecule, you're going to put it in canonical form. That means the vertices are enumerated in a normal way, in a normal form kind of fashion, and then you can look up in the database, for example, that this is adrenal. Yeah, this is how you use these databases. This is one of the applications of canonical forms. Okay, we can also do isomorphism checks with that, and it's kind of clear that we can do that. So if you have a canonical labeling, then you get an isomorphism from your graph to the canonical form, and that means it enumerates the vertices, the first, second, third, and fourth. And that means if you have two graphs, you can use the two canonical labelings to check whether the graphs are isomorphic. So this works as follows. If the ith vertex of G1 goes to the ith vertex of G2, then that must be an isomorphism. I have a picture that explains this. So let's say you have G2 and G1, and I have these canonical mappings to the canon. You can actually just combine the one map and then the inverse of the other, and that will be an isomorphism from here to here. So if I have isomorphisms to some common canonical form, then I can compose one with the inverse of the other to get an isomorphism between these things. And that means canonical labeling or computing canonical forms is a problem that is at least as hard as graph isomorphism. We don't know whether these problems are equivalent, but for many, many things we know, for many concrete classes, we know that the running times turn out to be the same. So we don't have a formal reduction, but it seems that these problems are always almost the same. Okay, so many practical isomorphism algorithms actually compute canonical forms and labelings. Okay, here's a summary of computation times for canonical forms of objects. I don't want to go too much into detail. The way you should read this is that for most things, the canonical labeling algorithm is as fast as the isomorphism algorithm. So we did this some years ago with a student of mine, Daniel Wiedking. For example, for hypergraphs, you have single exponential time or simply exponential time. For hypergraphs of a certain color class, you can do it for permutation groups, codes, combinatorial objects, and so forth. You should take away that usually the best canonical labeling algorithm matches the best isomorphism algorithm. And as I said, if you want to talk about this, we can do this offline. All right, that's it for canonization. And I think it's important to understand that this is how often these tools are used in practice. There are other applications though, and I want to talk about this a little bit. And one of the applications is to extrapolate from symmetry. So here you see the smile of Scylla. It's a roof end tile from the roof you see before. And what I want to imply here is that you know there's a piece missing here, but because this is a symmetric object, we know how it's going to look here. Yeah, so you can just, I mean, actually you only need the left half, because the right half is going to be exactly the same. Yeah. All right, so applications of symmetry computation are, for example, you want to generate all kinds of objects of a certain type. For example, chemical molecules such as fullerenes, there are tools that generate these. So here are two molecules, the truncated, two fullerenes. Here's a carbon nanotube, here's a truncated icosahedron. You may recognize it better as in a soccer ball kind of fashion. Then another way we use symmetry in computations, for example, here in a computer game Factorio, if you build a part and you know that you now just have to copy exactly the same thing to repeat it, then you just have to build it once, and then you can extrapolate using symmetries onto the rest. And here you save work, is what I'm saying. Right? Another kind of application is these databases that I talked about earlier about the adrenaline. Now, there are also applications in machine learning. So there are two general ways to put graph isomorphism techniques into machine learning. One of them is kind of old, from 2011, is called Weisfeiler-Leman kernels. We did that back in the day. And another more new way of doing that is graph neural networks. And some of the stuff I will talk about in the end, Weisfeiler-Leman, is very much related to that, but I don't want to make this talk about machine learning. If you're interested in machine learning, please speak to me afterwards. Yeah, so there are applications in machine learning, and I want to leave it at that. All right, here is now one explanation how you exploit symmetry in computation. Let's say you have a graph, and you want to compute the shortest path from S to T. Yeah? Okay, this graph has a symmetry, a horizontal symmetry, which you can see. That means if we have a path like that, there will be a symmetric path like that. Yeah? Actually, because there's the symmetry here like that, I can infer that there will also be a path that goes up like that and then uses the symmetric part up here. Yeah? So I can actually flip it up. And if we analyze this picture, it means we actually never have to look at the lower part of the graph at all. Yeah? If we want to compute the shortest distance between S to T or all shortest paths, we can just cut off the lower part and then extrapolate using symmetries. And this is really how we exploit symmetries to speed up computation. We cut off a branch that looks similar to another branch, isomorphic to another branch, symmetric, and we know we can find within this branch, we can find the same kinds of solutions as in the other branch. It is actually vital in some instances of, for example, SAT solving to exploit symmetry in this kind of way. A prime example people give is the pigeonhole principle. If you don't exploit symmetry, most solvers will really struggle with the instances. Another way of handling the same issue is called symmetry breaking. So if you have a formula like the one at the beginning, A or B and B or C and A, you remember this formula. This is symmetric in A, B, and C. And you can add another clause to artificially break the symmetry. You can say not A or B to break the symmetry between A and B. And from that point onwards, only these non-symmetric solutions will be found if you add this clause to the SAT solver. And it turns out that that improves the speed of SAT solvers because they reduce the search space. This is called symmetry breaking. If you want a more modern explanation or a current explanation of this, a student of mine, Markus Anders, and two postdocs, Sophia Brenner and Gaurav Ratan, they have a nice paper on that, how this is used currently in SAT solving. Yeah. All right. That is it for applications. Are there any questions for applications? All right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the tools we use in graph isomorphism testing. Okay, what you can see here are metal tools from the Gyeongju National Museum. Yeah, they're all iron actually. You can see swords. I think these are the ingots up here,
Yep.
from which they form the other stuff.
Axes, arrowheads.
All right, so this is a recent picture we took. Okay, but how do we use it? So these are very old tools. I'm going to talk about slightly newer tools, and then I will come back to current. So what's the history of tools in symmetry detection? So in 1977, Brendan McKay coded a tool called Naughty. Many people know this because this, for the longest time, this used to be the undisputed champion in graph isomorphism testing and canonical labeling. So this tool actually does canonical labeling. You give the graph, it computes the canonical labeling. It can also provide the automorphism group for you and so forth. And for the longest time, that was the tool to use until roughly in 2004, some people from the SAT community started implementing something that was specific to SAT, yeah, called Saucy. And so this was very good in particular for sparse graphs. And that prompted Brandon to come up with Naughty 2.0, which was a sparse version of exactly the same tool, but he didn't use adjacency matrices anymore, and he made it more efficient and so forth. And there was a phase here where there were several algorithms. So my PhD thesis is in this, and Bliss by Tom Juntila and Peter Ikaski, and then Adolfo Piperno came up with traces. And traces is for many graphs still the fastest algorithm. Actually, traces and Naughty are usually distributed in a common package nowadays. So these are all open source. You can download them and use them and so forth. All right, and then there's another tool called ConAuto, which has some other nice ideas. There's VSEP, and then in this project that I'm describing, we also started developing our own tool, and I will tell you a little bit about some ideas of the tool, but not really go much into detail. And it's called Déjà Vu. All right, so in 2015 at the Dutch tool meeting, Brandon McKay, he said, well, we kind of have a problem. The theory and the practice of isomorphism detecting, isomorphism problems and symmetry detection is like distinct galaxies with a few shining stars in the middle. So he meant that there's a kind of a disconnect. So on the theory side, we have this graph isomorphism problem. We want to know, is it NP or NP complete? We want to determine the complexity, and we claim it's the biggest open problem, not the biggest, one of the bigger open problems in theoretical computer science. And the practitioners, they want symmetry detection, they want it to be fast, they want it to work on the computer, and so forth. And as I said, it's being used in other tools. All right, and this disconnect is kind of something that we also worked on at that Dutch tool meeting. So Latsli Babai, he actually gave a talk about his algorithm at this meeting. So half a year before, he said, I think I have something. And then he talked for 6 hours, 2-hour blocks, about this new algorithm. He basically described the new algorithm, yeah? And anyway, all the practitioners are there and so forth. Okay, here are some actual running times for the tools that you can use. So you see the different tools here, but what you see is they kind of scale the same, for example, on random graphs, and this is a log plot. So you should take from it that they're super fast. On random graphs, they're super fast, yeah? And even if you take random 3 regular graphs, this plot should look to you like they're super fast. 8,000 vertices, 10 seconds, no problem.
So random graph with which probability? So
these are deterministic tools.
I mean, GN half or like.
This is GN 1/2. Sorry. Yeah, this is GN 1/2. Yeah. And this is probably actual random 3 regular graphs, maybe up to isomorphism. But usually these questions don't make a difference, whether you do it up to isomorphism or you do it just arbitrary graphs. Yeah. Because most graphs don't have automorphism groups. Okay, so these are the running times, and you should take this as these tools are really, really fast. If you implement this yourself, you will probably struggle keeping up, in particular on easy graphs. Okay, however, there are very, very hard graphs. So in 2018, we designed some graphs called we actually modified some multiplets by Gurevich and Shalach for particular instances and proved that all of these tools have exponential running time on them. So here you see on 1,400 vertices, these tools don't finish anymore in a couple of hours. But you should understand that these graphs were only made to make these tools slow. They don't have practical importance and they don't show up in practice. And we also know how to solve them with other algorithms, but not with the standard algorithms. Yeah? They have bounded degrees, so there are some algorithms. Okay, now I want to talk about the new ideas of our tool. And okay, of course it's a broad topic and I'm not going to go into how these programs really work. But I want to kind of describe one particular aspect. And you can understand that separately from everything else. And for me, I call it kind of the algorithmicist's dream. This is the first and only time this has worked for me. So we took a problem from practice. We want to solve something faster, namely symmetry detection. And we translated it into theory. And then we solved the theory optimally. It was abstracted. And then we translated it back to in practice, and it worked. Yeah, this is exactly what you want, right? But as I say, this is the only time I've ever managed to do that. Okay, and I'm not going to talk about how we get from isomorphism testing to this theory problem or how we get back. There's a lot of implementation. Marcus Anders, he's really good in implementing, and there's a lot of work involved here and a lot of work involved here. But this problem we can understand today, yeah, and the solution. What it is these tools are kind of recursive tools. Yeah, abstractly it's a recursive algorithm, and they generate these recursion trees. And the recursion trees, I will promise to you that the leaves are colored with different colors, and the inner vertices are not colored. And what I will also promise to you is that we are in one of two situations. We want to do isomorphism. Either we have two isomorphic trees. That means that the colors map isomorphically with the leaves, just like we talked about at the beginning, or they're totally different. Yeah, they don't have any colors in common. I don't think we can see at this very moment why these two options must be the case, but if the graphs are non-isomorphic, then none of the leaves, none of the canonical forms can be equivalent. Yeah, it's a bit difficult to see, but this is the situation. Yeah. Okay, so this is the situation. And now the goal is to decide in which of these two situations are we. Is it this one or is it this one? And the way we explore the trees is as follows. So we don't have to look at the whole tree, because looking at the whole tree is too expensive. It turns out that the number of vertices in the tree we visit is basically the running time of the algorithm. So we want to visit as few vertices as possible. Yeah, so the number is to be minimized, and the exploration model is as follows. We get the two roots of the two trees, and then you can query an arbitrary child. You can say, I want to look at this child of that. And if you do that, say you want to query this child, I will reveal to you what node it is and how many children it has. And then you can say, oh, interesting, maybe I want to see here. Yeah? So what is this? And I will tell you, oh, this is a leaf, this is blue. And now you can choose, for example, you say, okay, I want to know this vertex. Because at this moment, these two trees could be isomorphic. Yeah, it could be that this branch goes here, so let's have a check. Okay, this might match, Let's say, what about this one here? Oh, this is red. Okay, it could still be that the blue one goes here. Let's have another look. What about this guy? Okay, so it has degree 3. That means this branch here cannot be mapped to this branch. Because where does the red one go? Yeah? All right, so let's move on. Let's say we can look at this green one. Okay, let's look at this one. We move on, we query, and at this point we know that these trees are not isomorphic. Yeah? So it cannot be, because this branch here can't go to that, because the colors don't match, and this doesn't go to here because this is orange and this one's green. So we stop and we say non-isomorphic. The clue is now we have not traversed the whole tree. So we saved some run. This is the model. Okay. Now, what strategies would there be? We could do deterministic. Yeah, we could just go, for example, depth first search or breadth first search, one of the trees and then check the other one. In the worst case, that means we have to check almost everything. Yeah? In particular, it will be n nodes for one of the trees, even if we kind of alternate. If we do it deterministically, it turns out that we will have to look at one of the smaller of the trees entirely. But there's randomization. Okay. Turns out that when you do randomization, it suffices to do square root of n many nodes, where square root of n is the number of leaves in the tree. And how do we do that? Well, we kind of randomly sample. Does anybody know why we get square root here? It's maybe a difficult question.
Is this accurate or I don't know? Increasing sources.
So
Just
it's random sampling, and it turns out to be related to the birthday problem.
Oh.
Okay? So if the year has 365 days, then the number of people we need in a room for the probability to be high that at least 2 people have the same birthday is roughly square root of n. So it turns out to be 23, and that's just a rounding small number problem. It's actually square root of n. It grows like square root of n. So if we sample in the 2 trees sufficiently much, in both trees alternatingly, and we've sampled square root of n many leaves, the probability that we have seen matching colors will be very, very high. And if we can live with an error, we can say, okay, at this point, if we haven't seen equal colored leaves, we just say they're probably not isomorphic. Now, this is a Monte Carlo algorithm. It makes errors. But there is a Las Vegas version. And we call it the Kraken. It's very easy to understand. So I hope you can get this picture from this slide. Yeah? So it's randomized without errors. The strategy is as follows. We have the two roots. And in the first tree, we're going to sample a path down to half the height. And below that, we're going to sample everything. Yeah? So we go to half the height, and then the entire subtree below that will be explored. And on the other side, we do the opposite. We sample the entire upper half, and from each vertex here, we will sample one path down. Yes?
A stupid question, how do you know the height of the
How do you know the height of the tree? Let me get back to that. Yeah? Let's say we know the height, then we do this here. Okay? Now, let's say this is the height, and the tree is fairly balanced. What happens now? Okay, this vertex here, if they're isomorphic, must be one of these. Yeah? Let's say it's this one. That means this down here must be one of these. So if they're isomorphic, we would have seen equal colored leaves at this point. So we're guaranteed that we've seen the same. Okay, now how about the heights? Well, the algorithm is slightly more complicated than that. We will have to use some doubling strategy, and that is where the randomization comes in. So we try with a certain height, and if it didn't work, we double the height and start over, and so forth. And kind of standard online algorithms say that's okay, it doesn't matter. But that's also up to this point. It would be deterministic, but that's the reason why it's actually randomized. Yeah? And also, if the tree is unbalanced, we will also have to kind of find the large subtrees that are not so deep and so forth. But basically, this is the only trick. Yeah? I think the rest you could just do yourself. And it turns out we can do this. We can put this into theory. Okay, so this naughty tool from Brandon McKay from the 70s, it actually does depth first search. And Adolfo's tool, Pipano's tool does breadth first search, and our tool does randomized sampling. And we can formally prove that you cannot beat certain bounds with deterministic versions or randomized versions. Yeah? So basically, if you are deterministic, it will be linear. But if you are Las Vegas, in certain conditions, if the degree is bounded, you can do root n. And this is the improvement. Yeah? And so we implemented that. But we also implemented a preprocessor. And I just want to mention the preprocessor. So the preprocessor takes large graphs. It's like a kernelization type of thing. It shrinks them. And when you use the preprocessor, then you can use all of the other solvers. And at that point, they're kind of fairly equal. Yeah? It depends a little bit. Anyway, if you really want one of these tools, maybe our preprocessor is currently the way to go. Because if you can live with randomization, if you can't live with randomization, use our preprocessor and one of the other tools. Okay, and of course I also have data that shows that this works. Yeah. So here this is the randomized version, and what you see here is an exponential speed up, but still exponential running time. Yeah. So if you have this is on these really bad graphs. So you have an exponential speed up, and this is how it shows up. Yeah. All right. Anyway, yeah.
The output of preprocessor is just color graph or without colors or with the colors?
I should say a little bit how this works. So if you have a large tree, let's say from a social media network, there will be many vertices of degree 1. And you can just kind of encode them into their neighbors, and you can remove tree-like appendages. And then you have a core graph. That core graph will be colored. You can feed that vertex colored core graph to any of the existing solvers. The existing solvers will compute the automorphism group, and when it comes back with the automorphism group, you can extend the automorphism group to the entire automorphism. So there's a post-processing phase that you compute the entire automorphism group again. And so some of these tools, for example, Naughty, doesn't really care about very simple, very large graphs. So it will take too long because it doesn't take care of the super easy stuff. And this preprocessor will take care of the super easy stuff, hand the difficult part to the solver, come back with the answer, and then expand it to the easy part. Yeah. And the way it works is that this preprocessor kind of levels the playing field and makes many of the solvers kind of similar. Yeah. And then you can use deterministic again, or canonization if you like. All right, so these are the experiments for these tools. That's what I wanted to say about these tools. Any questions about practical? As I said, you can download all of them. They're all freely available. Yeah.
A small, maybe silly question. In the previous slide, your solver ended up being slightly slower on the smaller instances than the rest. Is there any reason for that?
They're very tiny, right? So
up to 100.
So when you design large software libraries, you have to make compromises in every time you add something that's supposed to do something for large graphs. On the small graphs, it will just be useless.
Okay.
And basically, it should be that naughty, the original algorithm, is the fastest because it just does what it should do.
Yeah.
It doesn't. So basically, you should, if you really want to do this properly, you should have some flips, switches that say below this I do that, above this I do that, and so forth. Yeah. And I also have to say, so Brandon's tool is coded in C with very, very good low-level data structures, bit vectors and this kind of stuff. Yeah. And if you wanted a super fast tool nowadays, you would do that, but there's no point essentially anymore. It just increases your development loop so much that you can't test other things anymore. So we kind of code in higher. These are all C++ tools, but we code in a higher way of thinking rather than low level. And of course, using bit vectors and making everything tiny also makes it faster because you have less cache misses. Yeah. And when Brandon started, it was important that stuff fits into main memory and so forth. Yeah. So in some sense, some aspects are just coded in a better fashion. Yeah. Other questions about these tools?
So it seems that still, like for small graphs, Naughty is still the fastest.
It's my understanding. Yeah. So basically, you shouldn't do anything that is not standard at that point. You shouldn't be smart at small graphs. So sorry, Naughty is also very, very sophisticated. It's not a simple tool, yeah, and it's highly engineered and it's still being developed. I'm not saying it's a simple tool. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that's it for tools. And now, in the last 15 minutes, as I warned you, question.
Question here.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you showed this timeline of tools being developed. Which algorithms do they use? Is it
Which kind of what do they use?
I mean, I'm not sure the question makes sense, but to which theoretical algorithms do they correspond somehow?
Okay, so
is it the classical Lux-Babai technique?
Okay. That's a very good question. You're asking what is the algorithmic framework.
Yes.
The algorithmic framework of all of these tools is basically the same. It's called individualization refinement framework. And we will see now the refinement part of this individualization refinement and also slightly the individualization part. Yeah, but I won't go too much into detail. But on the surface, they all work the same, and then the details on how to navigate the search tree and so forth, that's where they differ. Maybe on low-level data structures they differ. They do not use the computational group theory algorithms from the 80s that Lux developed, yeah, and Babai people afterwards and so forth. They are, for many instances, theoretically the fastest, but they're slower in practice, yeah. There are some implementations of things like that in GAP, for example, but none of these tools use that because it turns out to be slow in the end. Yeah. For particular graphs, it might be different, but usually they just and they all work in some sense on the same framework. All right. So I will now talk a little bit about that because I will talk about colors and Weisfeiler-Leman. So this is more recent work and some results. So here's a picture from the grotto near the Bulguksa temple. Yeah, and these are the, I think they're called lanterns. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and so this is one way of putting down the colors. Let's talk about some other way of putting down the colors. You will kind of see this picture in a second. Okay. Now, if we want to compute, let's go back and start off again with the graph, and we want to compute the symmetries. What could we do? Let's say we want to explore the automorphisms of a graph combinatorially. What could we do? The first observation is that a vertex of a particular degree must go to a vertex of the same degree. If you have 3 edges coming out, your image must have 3 edges coming out. Yeah? So degree 3 vertices go to degree 3, degree 4 to degree 4, and so forth. But on top of that, if I map a degree 3 vertex to a degree 3 vertex, its neighborhood would be mapped to its neighborhood. So the degrees I see in the neighborhood will be the degrees I see in the neighborhood of the vertex. Yeah? So the neighborhood of a vertex is mapped to the neighborhood of a vertex, and that means that the degrees that appear in the neighborhood of a vertex will be the degrees that appear in the neighborhood of a vertex. And of course, the degrees of the neighbors will appear in the degrees of the neighbors with the right multiplicity and so forth. Now this can be iterated, and there's an automated way of doing that, and it's called color refinement. And I'm not really going to define that. I'm just going to give you an example, and I'm just going to use colors. Here's a random graph. Well, it's a fixed graph, but let's say it's a random graph. Okay. I'm going to color the vertices by their degrees. Okay, the degree 0 vertices, they get green. Degree 3 vertices, they get orange. Now orange goes to orange under automorphisms. And now I can recolor vertices according to the colors of the neighbors. Yeah? So that splits them up further. So this one has now a purple neighbor, and that means it's different from all the others. And it turns out on random graphs, this basically always works. It will just split up all the vertices into different colors. So that's on a random graph the process, and then we're done, and now we can see that vertices with equal colors will actually be symmetric, while others are in the same orbit. Okay, here's another example, the path. Now here these are different than these because they have degree 1, but everything else has degree 2. So the outside vertices are going to get some different colors. But now these are different. This one has a blue neighbor, this one has 2 orange neighbors. So they're going to get different colors, and this moves on into the inner bit, and now you can see this is actually done. Yeah? Okay. Here comes my picture from the lanterns from above. So one way to color them would be to recolor the corners because they have different degrees, and then this information travels into the inside. And this process is called color refinement. Here are some facts about color refinement. It almost always works. If you take a random GNP graph, then with high probability, it will color all the vertices with different colors. It cannot distinguish regular graphs of the same degree. So if you have a 3 regular graph and another 3 regular graph, it's not going to do anything. So it doesn't always work. Yeah? Often it doesn't work. We also have a precise characterization when it works, in case you care. It can be computed very, very quickly, which is why this is used in all of the tools that I talked about in the previous section. This is the basic subroutine. This is what you should implement first, and this is what you have to implement fastest. You really need to be good at color refinement, and then you're good to go. And it's used heavily in practice. Okay. I don't know why this slide is here. It shouldn't be. Okay. Okay. Now it doesn't always work, and there is a 2-dimensional version of doing it. So we colored vertices. Now what we're going to do, we're going to color pairs of vertices. And we're going to color pairs of vertices first into edge, non-edge, or a loop. So a vertex VV will be a loop. And then we're going to, in each iteration, distinguish pairs of vertices according to which triangles they're contained in. Okay, here's a short example, and if you need longer details, I'm happy to describe it up to Friday for a very long time. Okay, so let's say this edge here, we want to explore this edge. This is a pair, 1, 2. The new color, okay, let's remember that it has the orange. We're going to check which triangles it is in. So there are 3 triangles that are green-green. There's a green-green triangle, a green-green triangle, and a green-green triangle. When we write that down, there's 2 red-green triangles. There's 1 green-red triangle. So they're different because it's the pair 1, 2 is not the pair 2, 1, and so forth. And there's a blue-green triangle, there's a red-orange one, an orange-red one, and so forth. And if we encode all of this information now as a new color here, then that's the 2-dimensional version. Let me give you an example. If we start with this cycle, we will color the loops differently initially, then we will color paths of length 2, then we will color path of length 3 and 4, and so forth. So here's another, on a path, another example, it will kind of hop distance 2, then it will hop distance up to 4 and color all distances different, so it actually measures different distances and so forth. Yeah, and it will fill out the whole path. And here, if I have a beginning of a path, what actually will happen is that it will put in a directed edge automatically. Because it understands that this vertex here is between 2 black edges, but this one is not. That's why this one will be directed. Okay, that's the 2-dimensional version. There are graphs that are not distinguished by the 2-dimensional version. These are strongly regular graphs. The smallest pair that are not distinguished. There's a 3-dimensional version where you color triples. and you color them the tetrahedrons sitting above the triples and so forth, but let's not go into detail. Okay. The Weisfeiler-Leman dimension is now how high do I have to go? It's the least k that is needed so that the graph always is distinguished by the k-dimensional Weisfeiler-Leman, and this has been heavily researched in the past. Yeah. So, for example, there's a really nice book by Martin Grohe which shows that graphs with excluded minor have bounded Weisfeiler-Leman dimension. And for example, planar graphs have dimension at most 3. There's some nice planar embedding stuff and so forth. Some interesting graphs pop up here. Then I had to put in this line for rank width. It's bounded. Weisfeiler-Leman dimension is bounded for rank width. So we had a complicated group theoretic algorithm, like the looks stuff, and Daniel and Martin together. But with Martin and Daniel, they showed that the easy Weisfeiler-Leman algorithm actually works, right? So this is kind of exactly this question. The combinatorial algorithms are these tools, and the group theoretic algorithms are not used in practice. Anyway, there are examples where it doesn't work. So there are the famous Cypher-Immermann examples where it doesn't work. And also Babai's algorithm actually uses Weisfeiler-Leman as a subroutine. So he uses group theoretic and combinatorial algorithms.
Do you know the function for H-3 graphs? That
Oh.
dimension?
There is a paper. There's an explicit bound for genus. Is explicit bound for tree width. I don't think there is an explicit bound for. I'm not even sure. You certainly can be extracted, but I don't think there's an explicit bound given. Yeah. It may not be as bad.
Mhm.
Yeah. It may not be Robertson-Seymour type. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So it doesn't use the structure.
Now that's a difficult question. I shouldn't say anything on that. It's a thick book, right?
Okay.
It's
yeah, but can be looked at.
yeah. Martin would answer this. All right, so I should start to wrap up. So there is a logical way of looking at this. Yeah. So there's a way to describe all of this in logics, and this Weisfeiler-Leman refinement corresponds to a certain logic, fixed point logic with counting, if you've ever heard of it, and there are certain pebble games that are important in this context. And then the dimension corresponds to the variables, which corresponds to the number of pebbles, which is why these parameters are interesting. And the number of iterations, how long you have to do, corresponds to the quantifier depth of the formula, which corresponds to the length of optimal plays in some combinatorial Hobbes and Roberts games. Yeah? And this is well known, and this is kind of stuff we've searched. So we kind of ask how complicated does the logical formula have to be to distinguish graphs, and there are many parameters you can look at. How many variables do we need? How many iterations do we need? Can we restrict reuse of variables, called requantification? What's the computational complexity that arises? And can we do stuff other than graphs? Okay, here are some results on the iterations, and I warned you this will be quick. So we know how long the one-dimensional algorithm does. It takes n-1 rounds in the worst case. The two-dimensional takes at most n log n, but at least linear. And there's a recent result for k-dimensional, which is super linear. So we know now that the k-dimensional algorithm can take n to the k half. And this has applications in proof complexity. If you're interested in this, I'm happy to talk about this. Or anything for that matter.
I have a small question. So
Yes.
each iteration is probably much more costly as I go up in dimensions. Like,
Yes.
where does this exchange happen in practice?
So the k-dimensional version is n to the k.
Yeah.
The exchange happens at the two-dimensional level. You don't use
Okay.
two-dimensional, basically, you just use one-dimensional.
Okay.
Because you use individualization, you artificially give a vertex a different color rather than doing the whole thing in the whole graph, and that overall seems to be better.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, then we have a new result that shows that the absolute dimension for all graphs, what are the bounds, and they're between 3/20 and 0.04 n. So this is structural graph theory in the isomorphism sense, where you try to understand the different pieces and so forth. This will be at ICART now. And then, so the previous best bound is basically n/4 by independent work of Sandra Kiefer and Daniel Neuen, who were also in Aachen. Then we have some results on complexity and requantification. but I think I'm running out of time. Anyway, so okay, I will just mention them then. So if you want to know what the W dimension of a graph is, we have analyzed the complexity. How difficult is it to decide what the W dimension is? So it's NP hard even on graphs of color class size 4 to decide whether W dimension is a certain number. For fixed K and bounded color class size at most 5, you can solve it in polynomial time. And it's P hard for fixed K, and for certain very special cases, abelian color classes, we can solve the problem. But in principle, we don't really know yet what the complexity of computing the WL dimension is yet. Yeah.
Sorry, what does color class size here mean?
Okay, it means if you start with a colored graph, and there's at most 4 red ones, 4 blue ones, 4 green ones, then you know that they must be within each other. And that's a particular graph class that appears as subclasses in these algorithms, and usually they're easier. So for these kinds of graphs, isomorphism problems are easier and so forth, but for the WL dimension, they're not easier. Yeah. So even if you color the vertices in packs of 4,
Yeah.
WL dimension can still be high.
Yeah, so this is saying even if there's already not that much to distinguish.
Yes.
Okay.
It's still difficult for this combinatorial algorithm to do it. While group theoretic algorithms can always do it in this case. Yeah. It's kind of a boundary for these two different approaches. That's why it always appears.
What is P hard? I never.
Yeah, under log space reduction, P hard under log space reduction. So it is not known whether graph isomorphism is P hard under log space reduction. Yeah, this is a big open problem. As opposed to NP hard under polynomial time reduction. So it's in these AC0 complexity class, circuit complexity classes, and this kind of stuff. Yeah. All right, and then we have another result which talks about reusing variables or reusing pebbles in these games, or the quantifier depth, and we can basically tell you what happens if you restrict reuse of variables. Yeah. This can then, you can save space if you don't reuse variables, because you don't have to memorize stuff. You can do it once. So some stuff goes into log space rather than polynomial space. Yeah, and there are corresponding logics in bijective pebble games, just like there's corresponding logics in pebble games for everything. And they, as you get into more detail, they get worse and worse and worse, but these can still be understood. They're still okay. They're not awful. Right, and then it turns out that there are no succinct normal forms. You may have to play the pebble game for a long time until you use something that's not reusable, and then you play for a long time and you use something again. So that means formulas can be very long, essentially. All right, so that's it. But as I said, I'm happy to talk about the results more. Okay, but I have 1 more minute, I hope. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, so I have a prize money for a proof that graph isomorphism is in P, or a proof that graph isomorphism is not in P. Yeah, it's €725. It's a special kind of prize, because every time I give a talk about graph isomorphism, I actually add €5. So now we're at €730.
Did you start at some value?
I started at €100. This happened at a conference where at a dinner in the brewery where we discussed. Yeah, so it has to be a little bit interesting. But there are many consequences I didn't see coming. For example, I'm afraid maybe some people hold back their solution because they're waiting for the money. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm happy to discuss any solutions you may have. Understand that there are many, many wrong solutions already, so maybe you should take a professor of your choosing to double check whether it makes sense what you did. Quite probable, if you have some algorithm which you think works, it is actually subsumed by the WL algorithm. It's a very, very powerful algorithm, and people don't see that many things, many algebraic approaches, eigenvalue approaches, and so forth, are actually subsumed by this algorithm. And then they think, oh, I have it, because why shouldn't it work? But then these Cipher-Immermann graphs, they just show it doesn't work. All right, so you can cash that in if you just drop me a line. All right, so that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Questions? Do you have any questions?
We may have asked all the questions during
Yes.
the talk.
But this, so I was using Noti for my own project, and my impression, I mean, of course I try to understand how it works, but it's like very, like how should I say, old-fashioned code that maybe the current generation wouldn't really understand.
Mm.
So it's like your code could, I mean, be more easier to
Okay, so
understand, or more modern, or
So I think a fair question is, so Markus Anders, PhD student of mine, he graduated recently. He wrote the software. He's a proper computer scientist, yeah, so he used modern tools and so forth. I think it looks quite different. More importantly is the question of the API, yeah? So you probably don't even want to look into the code. You want to know how to use it and what the interface is.
Right.
And that is a more complicated question than you think at first, right? So we have, at TU Darmstadt, we have another professor, Mark Fetch. They develop a mixed integer programming solver called Skip. It's an open source mixed integer programming solver. And we convinced him to start using our tool for symmetry detection. And we talked a lot about the interface and how they want the hook to look like and how they want answers to get back and so forth. And that helped improve a lot. So for example, it turns out that in practice, when you get the automorphism group, you usually get the generators. Here's a list of generators that generates the group, but you don't want any old generators. You want generators that don't move a lot of points. For example, small transpositions and so forth. And this is something that wasn't considered before. So now we're trying to develop kind of stuff on top of the API that presents the result to you in the fashion that you want it. So for example, something else that happens is it gives you back the generators in this group theoretic form, but it completely forgets that you had a graph. Yeah, and actually you want both of these things back, and then you want them in a fashion that your tool can also, I mean, your tool came up with the graph for some reason, and then you want to manipulate the graph that you've given, and you want to immediately work on with the graph. And this is kind of one of the problems. But yeah, so there are now tools that are a bit more modern, but as we saw, they're a bit more slower on smaller graphs. Yeah, because this kind of old, But most of them are C++ libraries anyway. If you want to use them on a higher level, other tools implement them. For example, Sage. Yeah, if you use Sage, Sage can use Naughty, for example, and then you don't have to worry about these low-level details. There's a computer algebra system, Oscar, we're developing, and we want to input that into at some point.
You gave an explicit comparison of the new algorithm with the rest for these special instances you constructed. How does it look in general?
Okay, so on many practical graphs, our tool is fastest. It's really faster than previous tools, which is why my colleague started to use it in his mixed integer programming solver. And he says for the symmetric instances, it gives you a boost of a couple %, which is big for them. Yeah. He says that's big for them. It really depends on what you want to do. If you don't mind the randomization and you want it to be fast, it's worth a shot. It's probably faster, our tool. But if you want deterministic answers and the running time doesn't matter, like a factor of 2 doesn't even matter to you, then you probably don't want this randomization aspect, because it also makes development harder. Because you get errors sometimes and sometimes not, because there's randomization involved and so forth. But in principle, it's the fastest tool for symmetry computation at the moment. Yeah. Also on practical graphs. There's a large benchmark library on which we have extensive experiments. Yeah. And Marcus's goal was to be fastest on every single graph. I don't think he managed, but he's fastest on many graphs.
So there's currently not like an instance like the one you constructed that fails for all the solvers.
Well, if you make these instances scale, if you make them larger, then all the solvers fail. Okay. You can just make them larger. Like if you take graphs on 5,000 vertices, they will not finish.
Mm-hmm. Sure, but the graphs you constructed were fairly small, like 300 vertices or something like this, and they made the older solvers.
I think it's kind of we're
Ooh.
So we're talking
Oh no.
1,400 vertices
Sure.
1 hour, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, that's just 1 hour. Okay. So I'm basically asking if you have like some narrow class of graphs where you know these are the hard instances for graph isomorphism, and if there's like a good description of what you think is the hard class.
This is a very interesting question.
Mm.
As opposed to problems that we know are NP complete, we don't know how to create hard instances for graph isomorphism.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you want a hard instance for SAT, we go to the boundary, we do some random instances,
Yeah.
we check where the threshold is, and all of the instances will be hard, and none of the tools will solve them.
Yeah.
But it takes a big effort to create graphs that look similar but are not isomorphic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we don't, in principle, we don't know how to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were using this randomized algorithm, and then I thought your algorithm was generate canonical form.
No, it doesn't
It doesn't.
generate.
I
No.
see.
We don't know how to do that with this randomization.
I see.
Yeah, because so what the deterministic tools do, they look for the smallest leaf, the best color or something like that in the tree. But if you don't look at everything, you may have missed it,
I see.
and we don't know how to solve this problem.
So your
Yeah.
solver can do the isomorphism.
Yes, and the symmetry computation, we can compute the automorphism too,
Uh-huh.
but we don't know how to compute canonical labelings.
Ah,
In particular, if you want canonical labelings, then you need to use some other tool.
I see.
Yeah.
Alright. Any other questions? So if not, let's thank the speaker.